but welcome. Okay, we're getting a ton of people on this call, which is a very good sign. Wow, okay. And we'll start in a few seconds. It is 12 on the nose. Okay. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the Quincy Institute's event today entitled Ending the Conflict in Ukraine, a Negotiated Solution. My name is Kelley Vlahos and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and editorial director of our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. If you are not familiar with the Quincy Institute, it is a transpartisan think tank dedicated to promoting a U.S. foreign policy of diplomatic engagement with the world, rather than pursuing military primacy to resolve problems or defend U.S. interests overseas. I am proud to moderate this panel today, on which we have three esteemed speakers and experts on U.S. foreign policy who also specialize in Russian and European affairs and history, as well as American security alliances. In short, this is going to be an informative discussion and quite a salient one, as a NATO membership met yesterday in Brussels and President Biden is meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow. As we know, the United States and its European partners face a host of security challenges, but I don't think any has taken up more oxygen as the yet to be resolved issue of Ukraine. Since a revolution broke out with Western support in 2014, toppling the elected leader, President Yanukovych, and with him the government, followed by the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea, security in the country has been in flux, particularly on its Russian border. Ukraine wants into NATO and Russia has warned against it. Meanwhile, military skirmishes between both sides continue in the Donbas region with no end in sight. So what can the United States do? My colleague, Anatol Lieven, just published a fantastic paper entitled Ending the Threat of War in Ukraine, a Negotiated Solution to the Donbas Conflict and the Crimean Dispute, in which he calls for a restoration of the principles outlined in the Minsk II agreement as a way to avoid a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is what we will talk about today. How do we get peace in the region without starting a war and a regional conflict in which the U.S. does not want to be embroiled? So first, I will introduce our panelists, and then I will turn it over to Anatol to talk a little bit about his paper and the major points of discussion today, and then we'll get into a broader conversation. So first, I would like to introduce Anatol Lieven. Anatol is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He was formerly a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar in the War Studies Department of King's College, London. He is a member of the academic board of the Rhode Institute or discussion group rather in Russia, and a member of the advisory committee of the South Asia Department of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. From 1985 to 1998, Anatol worked as a British journalist in South Asia, the former Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, and covered the wars in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Southern Caucasus. He is author of several books on Russia and its neighbors, including The Baltic Revolutions, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, and Ukraine and Russia, a Fraternal Rivalry. Next, we have Emma Ashford, who is a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, focusing on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. She has expertise in the politics of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. Previously, she was a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. She founded and co-hosted their Power Problems podcast. Her long-form writing has been featured in publications such as Foreign Affairs, the Texas National Security Review, and Strategic Studies Quarterly. And her opinion writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest, among others. Last but not least, Nicolai Petro is Professor of Political Science and the former Sylvia Chanley Professorship of Peace Studies and Nonviolence at the University of Rhode Island. His books include Ukraine in Crisis, Crafting Democracy, Russian Foreign Policy, and the Rebirth of Russian Democracy. He is the recipient of the Fulbright Awards to Russia and Ukraine. As a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow, he served as Special Assistant for Policy towards the Soviet Union in the U.S. Department of State from 1989 to 1990. So wow, we have some real firepower on this panel today, and I'm looking forward to discussion. So I'm gonna put it over to Anatol now to discuss his paper and highlight some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. So take it away, Anatol.
Thank you so much, Kelley. And many, many thanks to Emma and Nicolai for agreeing to take part. I'm most grateful. The conflict in the Donbas is the only ongoing armed conflict in Europe today. It is semi-frozen, but it is subject to periodic episodes of unfreezing, as earlier this year. And there is a permanent risk of another major explosion. Not only, of course, between Ukrainian forces and the separatist forces, but also the Russian volunteer forces, so-called, in the Donbas, and the Russian army, because Russia has made it repeatedly clear that if there is an attempt by Ukraine to take the region back by force, Russia will fight. The Donbas issue has even, it's been said, presented a risk of full-scale war between America and Russia because of America's commitments, semi-commitments to Ukraine. Now, on that score, I think it should be pointed out that whatever the present discourse in Washington, previous generations of American statesmen, let alone American citizens, would have considered the idea that America should go to war with Russia over the sovereignty of the Donbas, an area of which the absolutely overwhelming majority of Americans had never heard. Experts would have regarded this as so ludicrous and insane as to be, I mean, beyond the bounds of discussion. And there is a real question of how on earth did America, the American establishment, come to assume that there is such a huge American interest in this region, which, even if it doesn't lead to war between America and Russia, is a deeply, deeply destabilizing factor on the international scene and the single most disruptive factor in US-Russian relations. Because all the other issues either involve no threat of violence, however tense and disputatious they may be, or in certain cases, notably Afghanistan and the struggle against Islamist terrorism, America and Russia are actually on the same side, whatever, once again, the present discourse in both capitals may say. Now, the Biden administration has expressed strong support, commitments to Ukraine, but short of NATO membership. There was an attempt yesterday by the Ukrainian government to maneuver President Biden into a stronger commitment to NATO membership, which Biden quite cleverly and carefully avoided. Fairly strong elements in Washington have advocated both NATO membership and or a much, much stronger American policy of arming Ukraine with much more formidable weaponry. Now, in my view, as expressed in this paper, these positions are both futile and very dangerous at once. It's a pretty bad combination for three reasons, which I think are incontrovertible. Firstly, if there is in fact a major war between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine will lose. Given the disproportion of forces, nothing that America can conceivably do in terms of aid to Ukraine will change that equation. Secondly, if there is such a war, the USA and NATO will not fight. We didn't fight for Georgia in 2008. We didn't fight for Ukraine in 2014. Certainly, if you look at opinion polls in the United States and in Europe, there is no will, no democratic will for such an appallingly dangerous conflict with, of course, the risk of nuclear war between the two nuclear superpowers. In other words, if there is war, Ukraine will lose, we will not help. The third point, though, is Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. as long as the Donbas conflict and the Crimean dispute, which I'll come to later if I have the time, remain open. Because this too would imply a Western commitment to fight for Ukraine, and it will be vetoed by America's European allies, who, whatever their rhetoric against Russia may sometimes suggest, have no intention whatsoever of fighting Russia. So, to move relations with Ukraine and to stabilize Ukraine and to stabilize US-Russian relations as far as possible, the Donbas conflict must be solved. And there is, in fact, the perfectly reasonable basis for such a solution, as Kelley mentioned, set out in early 2015 in the Minsk II declaration drawn up by France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine, and endorsed both by the Obama administration and by the United Nations. And it provides for a fully autonomous Donbas, but within Ukraine, under Ukrainian sovereignty, with Ukrainian control of the borders, but with special facilities for links between the Donbas and neighboring provinces of Russia, with which the population of the Donbas has ancient and very close familial and other relations. And this settlement would be guaranteed by the presence of some form of international peacekeeping force. Aspects of this declaration are, it must be said, fairly vague when it comes, for example, to provisions for demilitarization. But nonetheless, you have a full basis for a settlement there. And it must be said that a solution through regional autonomy, with linguistic rights, cultural rights, a measure of economic autonomy and demilitarization, is completely in tune with the approach that the United States and the West has taken and would take to separatist and ethnic conflicts elsewhere in the world. There is nothing special about this in international or historical terms. Now, since then, however, the Ukrainian government or governments, though they signed up to this, have in fact been the main factor, and the Ukrainian parliament, in blocking the implementation of such an agreement. And they have done so essentially by the insistence that full Ukrainian control of the Donbas should be restored before autonomy is handed over and guaranteed, and that and of course the complete withdrawal, the demilitarization of the separatist armed forces and the withdrawal of all Russian volunteers, and the entry of the Ukrainian army. And the government and the Ukrainian parliament have refused to make this offer or constitutional amendment establishing autonomy permanent. It's purely provisional and temporary. Now, I think it should be recognized that this basically demands that the separatist republics and Russia surrender their entire position in advance, with no guarantee that Ukraine will, in fact, in the long run, guarantee anything in terms of autonomy to the Donbas. This is not an approach which would rationally be endorsed by the West in any other circumstances, I believe. The main reason for this Ukrainian position appears to be twofold. The first is that such an autonomous region within Ukraine would act as a blocking factor against future Ukrainian membership of NATO and the European Union. And the second point, that it would act as a blocking factor against measures of cultural, linguistic, educational Ukrainianization of the existing Ukrainian state. Now, to this, there are two responses. The first is that it's quite true. It would act as a blocking factor against NATO membership, but NATO membership is also blocked by the conflict. As long as the conflict continues, in any case, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. In other words, Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, whatever happens. So that can simply be abandoned as a prospect. When it comes to Ukrainianization, while this may be thought to be a factor in strengthening Ukraine against Russia, I think, and this is something which Nicolai has written about very extensively, we also need to recognize that this form of ethnic nationalism, very strong authoritarian and chauvinist antecedents, is in fact an element in blocking Ukrainian moves towards the West. And as an official of the European Union said to me not so long ago, of course, naturally completely off the record, do we really want any more Hungaries and Polands in the European Union. So I will leave the Crimean issue to questions because I've run out of time, but this paper essentially sets out the argument that the only solution to the Donbas issue, the only way of stabilizing Ukraine and stabilizing both Ukrainian-Russian and U.S.-Russian relations is a solution based on Minsk II and internationally guaranteed autonomy within Ukraine for the Donbas region. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. And I just wanted to remind listeners, viewers, that if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A box below, and we'll try to sprinkle our conversation with your questions as we go along. I'd like, Emma and Nicolai, if you could maybe, speak to Anatol's points here that he's outlined that are fully fleshed out in his paper. But I will sort of ask you questions to sort of spur that conversation, but please feel free to engage, what he's said so far. Emma, I'd like to turn to you for a second, and in that spirit, just ask you a pretty broad question, but it's a question that I think that most people are asking today, particularly in the last 48 hours and watching the developments of the NATO meeting and some of the questions raised and in anticipation of the Biden-Putin summit tomorrow. Are the US and NATO actually willing to go to war to defend Ukrainian sovereignty over these territories that are in dispute? Should they be willing to defend Ukrainian sovereignty over these territories?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me, and thank you to Anatol for writing a really excellent paper. I'm going to give a very short answer to that question. I'm just going to say no. I think Anatol put this pretty clearly in his paper. If the US or NATO was going to defend Ukraine, we would have done so in 2014. If we were going to defend Georgia, we would have done so in 2008. So I don't think there's a lot of question about that. And I think the point that Anatol makes, where he basically says, well, we are arguing as if we're willing to defend Ukraine when we really aren't, and it's very obvious that we aren't, that does actually put us in quite a difficult position. So I guess let me just talk for a couple of minutes about sort of what I liked about the paper and some of the big questions I think it raised, and then hopefully we can go over to Nicolai for a few more comments. I really like this paper. I really appreciated you writing this paper because I think the situation in Ukraine has the potential to just slide into kind of frozen conflict oblivion. In frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet region and elsewhere persist for a reason, which is that, in some ways they're the worst of all worlds, nobody wants them to continue, but in other ways, all of the other solutions are unacceptable to the parties, and so the conflict persists. And as Anatol points out, we often have a tendency to assume that makes these safer situations, that makes them, something that we can tolerate. But as we saw just last year in Nagorno-Karabakh, sometimes they flare up into major war again. And so I think there really is an incentive to resolve this. And I would love to see the Biden administration, pick up this issue, pick up some of these recommendations and actually run forward with trying to resolve it. I do also have some sort of criticisms and some thoughts on areas where I think the paper needs a little more, or where we may need some more details to actually make this work in practice. But perhaps, Kelley, I should pass it back to you. I'm not sure if you had further questions or if you wanted me to sort of keep talking.
Well, I mean, if you want to keep talking about where that fleshing out should occur, or is that for an offline conversation, but if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the things that I really liked about the paper, I think at a very broad level, right, I think the diagnosis of the problem is good. It's absolutely correct. This is why we're here. And why prior ceasefires have failed. And I think the solution that Anatol proposes is also broadly correct. The reason that the Minsk settlements circled around these big issues, border control, autonomy for the Donbas, international peacekeeping, is because it's basically the only thing that's going to work, and also because it has been successful elsewhere in so many other conflicts. But I think a couple of things that I was a little unsure about, or perhaps think we might need to talk more about to actually put this into concrete steps for an administration. So, you know, the first is I don't think there's quite enough attention to incentives. Because this is, you know, the paper lays out a very reasonable settlement that, you know, that in theory is better for all parties, but in practice, you know, that's not really how politics works. And we've seen the Ukrainians, we've seen the Russians over the last, I guess at this point, 6 or 7 years, repeatedly sort of not fulfill their obligations for reasons of domestic politics. And so I know Anatol talks a little about incentives in the paper about things like perhaps intensifying sanctions on Russia if they don't come to the table, about offering Ukraine more aid. But it wasn't clear to me that those incentives were enough to overcome some of this sort of inertia. And so, you know, things that we could start talking about, concrete plans for lifting sanctions from the part of the US or Europe, talking about sort of Ukraine, the question of aid and conditionality, right? Because a lot of the aid to Ukraine is being held up by concerns about corruption. We might have to sort of put some of that to the side in order to incentivize them to actually come to the table on this. So more conversation about incentives and the role of sort of domestic politics in both places. And then I guess the other one that I will come back to, and this comes back to your question of you know, should the US, should NATO defend Ukraine? And I think the question that Anatol raises in the paper about neutrality as opposed to NATO membership for Ukraine, I think that's a bigger question. And it's not clear to me, so it is pretty clear to me from this paper, just from sort of watching the situation, that we do need to link, for example, the Donbas and Crimea issues, you know, in a settlement, that those need to be linked for either to succeed. It's not clear to me that we need to link the issue of neutrality for Ukraine. And while I personally sort of share the opinion that that would be best in the long run, I think inserting it into this conversation about the specific conflict in the Donbas may make it more difficult to reach a settlement on that front. You know, it would also require a major policy change on the part of the US and its partners in Europe. I mean, we saw this just yesterday where NATO released a statement reaffirming its commitment to someday offer Ukraine a membership action plan and let it join NATO. You know, that policy change, that could actually be your incentive for getting Russia to agree to this deal, right? But I think we need to have more conversation. It's not clear to me that it fits in this framework. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a while, but this is a really great paper and I look forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Emma. Anatol, do you want to respond to any of that or the question of neutrality, or should I just move on to Nicolai? Maybe we can catch up on that later.
Let's move on to Nicolai and then I'll. Mm-hmm.
Well, Nicolai, I you know, on that note, the domestic political situation. I mean, what Anatol outlines in his paper as a solution, is it tenable? I mean, there are critics who say that for domestic US political reasons, it's impossible for the Biden administration to adopt such an approach. What are your thoughts on whether or not this is realistic under the current administration in terms of solutions here?
I reread Anatol's piece with great pleasure and learned a lot from it. But there are some fundamental differences that I have with his approach. And we've already danced around some of the points I'd like to make. So I'd like, in my remarks, to concentrate on clarifying those disagreements, which will touch upon all of the issues which we've already been discussing. And I can do so in about 5 minutes. First of all, let me say I applaud Anatol's efforts and his optimism, but I do not share it. His analysis of the reasons for the failure of the current peace efforts is indeed spot on. I'd like to highlight those. The threat of war will not shift Russian policy. Sanctions have not worked and will not work. And committing to war, and this is, I think, is a very important one, committing to war, a war footing with Russia on the part of NATO would mean the US could no longer effectively check Chinese military expansion. I believe that's beyond us. But his suggestion of involving the US, which I understand is key to the solution being proposed, would, in my opinion, only add fuel to the fire. The US should be interested in a negotiated solution, but it is not, because US political elites calculate the benefit of peace differently from Europeans. The benefits of peace, as seen from Germany, France, and Italy, is measured in terms of a return to rapprochement, dialogue, and especially profitable business dealings with Russia. For the US, which defines Russia a priori as its adversary, these are not benefits but costs. This is also true for mainstream Ukrainian nationalists and for other European states that support open confrontation with Russia. But Anatol makes a good point. What about the overarching benefit of eliminating the possibility of war with Russia? I fear that this is not a threat that is taken seriously by the US and its allies. They are indeed, judging from their rhetoric, supremely confident that they can intimidate and coerce without suffering any serious consequences. And this is very much unlike the Cold War, where the threat of global Holocaust was considered real. Therefore, in my opinion, there is no chance of the US exerting any serious pressure on Ukraine to make a settlement. Indeed, the more confrontation, as Ambassador Kurt Volker recently put it, the more successful America is. For mainstream Ukrainian nationalists, meanwhile, and this is another point I want to highlight, Russian military victory over Ukraine is not a proven outcome. It is indeed a heroic alternative to perpetual enslavement to Russia. There is almost a religious faith among the ruling Ukrainian political elite that NATO membership will not only guarantee Ukrainian security, but permit Ukraine to challenge Russia with impunity in all matters, including military. It is therefore not incentive enough not to go to war, or even, as the Kerch Straits and the Wagner incident in Belarus demonstrate, not to provoke Russia into military action, the benefit of which would be expected to be NATO intervention. Opponents, says Anatol quite rightly, have a duty to say what they themselves are proposing. But I think they've been doing that all along. They are proposing a new containment that will drive Russia into isolation. It is presumed that this isolation will create discontent and eventually rebellion against Putin and his system. This will then result in the emergence of a pro-Western regime in Russia, as it has in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. This is obviously a very dangerous fantasy, but one that a lot of serious people in Washington cling to. Just last October, former CIA Director John Brennan put it, quote, "Imagine prospects for world peace, prosperity, and security if Joe Biden were president of the United States and Alexei Navalny the president of Russia. We'll soon be there halfway." And then he ended with John Lennon's song, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." So how do we achieve peace? I think we need to think of Ukraine as a nested problem with many components. There is an international component, and Anatol deals with it brilliantly. That is the rivalry between the United States and Russia. Within that, there is the problem of bilateral relations between Ukraine and Russia, which has not evolved in a healthy way since Ukrainian independence in 1991. And there is the internal problem of Ukraine, which has not yet granted full civic recognition to the Russophone population, which constitutes roughly 40% of its total population. This last is, in my opinion, the core issue. the lack of an internal settlement among Ukrainians who, if they weren't disagreeing so vehemently amongst themselves, wouldn't be the object of contention that they are, because its competing constituencies could not be played against each other so easily. Ukraine will remain vulnerable to external manipulation for as long as its internal factions refuse to engage in a healing dialogue. And to do this, they must find a way to institutionalize Ukraine as a bicultural society. Without that, I'm afraid there is nothing that any external party can do that would result in a lasting peace. And that's why I'm overall not terribly optimistic. Signing off from Ukraine, by the way.
Thank you, Nicolai. Anatol, would you like to talk a little bit about that internal healing that must happen before any of these external solutions can be applied, and anything else that our fellow panelists have raised about your paper and current situation?
Well, first of all, I'd like to really thank Nicolai and just to express a wish that my family could have been here. They're in another room, to hear him say that I'm an optimist. That is something that people very rarely say about me. My elder sister says I've been a pessimist since the age of 6 months, and she was there. So, actually, I don't disagree, or hardly disagree with any of Nicolai's analysis at all. Certainly his portrayal of the positions of the United States and of the Ukrainian government and nationalists, I think, are spot on. But I think the answer is that on every one of the points, the positions that he set out, the answer is they're wrong. NATO will not guarantee, will not support Ukraine in challenging Russia as the Ukrainian nationalists would wish. NATO will not defend Ukraine in a war. The isolation of Russia simply means the isolation of Russia from the West. But of course, there is another player on the world scene. It's called China. And the more, as wise analysts have pointed out, the one thing that, geopolitical realism 101 tells you is not to drive your adversaries together, to keep them apart. This American strategy is in fact a strategy to help China by pushing Russia more and more into the arms of China. Something, by the way, which large parts of the Russian elite still do not want to do if they could find a way out. As for the notion that bringing down Putin will lead to a government of Navalny, and that if you had such a government, it would surrender Russian positions in Ukraine. For anyone who knows Navalny's background, for anyone who understands Russian nationalism and the attitudes of the Russian people, this is an absurd fantasy. Have we learned nothing from the experience of Aung San Suu Kyi and others, who may make nice noises in appealing to the West when they need to, but are in the end politicians of their own country and loyal to their country's interests. So I think Nicolai is quite right, but the positions that he sets out, all of these different elements, are wrong. Emma's remark, you're quite right, Emma, I should have put in much more about incentives. I mean, clearly, as far as Russia is concerned, the incentive is the lifting of sanctions. And that is why you're quite right. In the paper, by the way, I talk at some length about the Crimean dispute. I think you're right that they probably should be linked, because overall sanctions would have to be lifted in order to incentivize Russia. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I mean, if Ukraine blocks a viable settlement endorsed by the US, the West, the international community, the United Nations, well, there should be very, very heavy qualifications to the amount of aid that we would give Ukraine. By the same token, if they agree, we can enhance our aid. But clearly, it is economic sanctions and economic aid which are the principal leverage. But also, if Ukraine thinks it's going to, reject an international settlement widely endorsed, and if in future it leads to conflict with Russia, then you would have to be a very, very foolish Ukrainian nationalist to think that the West will fight for you in a future conflict. So those would be my my positions on that. Oh, and by the way, on Crimea, once again, I will be told that this is completely unrealistic in terms of American domestic politics. But actually, the solution is clear. It's a quid pro quo over Russian recognition of the independence of Kosovo. Every Russian official, if you talk to in private, knows that Kosovo is not going to return to Serbia unless the Serbians in future win a war, which they could do, the Albanians. And every sensible Western official, which may of course be a minority of Western officials, no comment on that one, knows that without a war in which Russia is defeated, which means defeated by America, Crimea is not going to return to Ukraine. It's been, according to Russia, legally annexed to Russia. No Russian government can give it up. And once again, if anybody thinks Navalny would give Crimea back, at least without an international formula that would leave it in Russia with some form of international recognition, they don't know Navalny.
May I?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Anatol, you're quite right. There should be an incentive mechanism. The incentives would have to be positive for good behavior and negative for bad behavior. But hasn't Ukraine been getting away with bad behavior for 6 years in terms of not implementing the political part of Minsk? And what have the consequences been? Zero.
Well, I mean, that, after all, is a key reason why I wrote this paper, and the Quincy, for which very many thanks, is publicizing it. Because one of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to get away with this is precisely that most of the think tanks in Washington, not everyone, most of the US media, not all of it, have in fact completely ignored both the fact that America has never disowned the Minsk Agreement, what the Minsk Agreement consists of, the rationality and acceptability of the Minsk Agreement in an international context, but also, of course, have indeed completely ignored the fact that it has been Ukraine that's been blocking it. So, I mean, one purpose of this paper look, I have no illusions that, that the US establishment will suddenly experience a Pauline conversion and make me Secretary of State. But this paper seeks to set out to the US political elites and media elites who, in my experience, may actually not know the basic facts of this conflict because nobody has ever told them, sufficiently. So the paper tries to set out some of the basic facts, which perhaps in the end is, all that a poor policy analyst can do, but also everything that an honest policy analyst has a duty to do.
Right, and you make a good point about the divide between what people know and what they've just seen, across headlines, over the years in terms of this conflict. And one of the issues that I find that really rose to the top and has been used as sort of a cudgel politically has been the aid, the military aid that the US has been given to Ukraine. And during the Obama administration, I remember Senator McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham admonishing Obama for not giving arms to Ukraine. And then the Trump administration, I believe, decided to do that. But where is that all now? And Emma, maybe you could talk a little bit about this neutrality issue. Is the US, and this is a question coming from one of our viewers, Ivan Snook, he says, US is providing arms, material, and financial aid to Ukraine. Is this not already a proxy war? And I would further ask, how can the US be a fair broker in any future negotiation if it's seen as putting its thumb on the scale for Ukraine?
So I appreciate the question and I appreciate the trap that it sets. The US has been engaged in sending arms and supplies to Ukraine. And the argument that many in Washington would make is that Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and that the Western countries are helping Ukraine to defend itself. Now, I would not object to that argument at all. The reason that I and many others objected to the notion of sending particularly lethal arms to Ukraine back in 2014 was the escalation risk and the fact that it could draw the US more deeply into that conflict than we wanted to be. So the question, I believe, is not so much about the arms or about the aid. It's about whether we are enabling escalation risk, and in this case, whether we're helping to prolong a conflict that we might otherwise be able to help. So when it comes to the question of the US position and the Minsk agreement, I actually somewhat agree with Nicolai here on his criticism earlier, where he said that bringing the US into this format is in some ways problematic. So the benefit of the Normandy format that produced the Minsk agreement was that it was European states who were both closer to the problem and also not seen by Russia as perhaps as partisan in this contest as the US has been, and that was what actually enabled the talks to happen. And so while I agree with Anatol that the US has to be involved in some capacity, I'm not sure that I agree that it should be the US taking the lead on this process. I'd like to see the original Minsk participants return to the table, try to work something out, but that deal would have the approval, the stamp of approval of the US and of various sort of international entities, particularly the UN if we needed UN peacekeeping. So I kind of agree with Nicolai here that the US has not engaged. This is not a proxy war in any sense, really. But the US has supported Ukraine against Russia in this case, and that may inhibit our ability to actually negotiate with the Russians on this question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Anton, please.
Yeah, yes. You may be right, Emma. The problem is, of course, that if the US is not involved, there will be, as there was, by the way, previously, as there has been, a permanent ability for Ukrainians opposed to the agreement to basically work with forces in Washington to block its implementation. And I'm afraid that after many, many years, speaking as a Brit and European myself, like you, of observing the Europeans in action, I have not so much confidence, shall we say, in their ability to push through anything, at least if they discover that there is pushback against it from Washington. As to the issue of arms supplies from the US and the possibility of increased arms supplies, you're absolutely right. This does not constitute a US willingness to go to war. It doesn't even constitute, as far as administrations have been concerned, a desire for a Ukrainian-Russian war. Absolutely not. But I think Nicolai really put his finger on the danger of this when he pointed out that there are a substantial number of influential, radical Ukrainian nationalists who think that it does, who actually believe in the need for war with Russia. And on that score, we should never forget, what happened in Georgia in 2008, where President Saakashvili believed, and the Georgian elites, that they had a promise of support from America, which they didn't have. America had never, guaranteed support in a war with Russia, but somehow they convinced themselves that it had, and they attacked Russian positions in South Ossetia, with, of course, disastrous results for Georgia. Now, on that score, it must also be said that this statement of Putin has, of course, to Barroso has been twisted into a statement of aggression against Ukraine. What Putin said was, look, we only took Crimea. I don't think he mentioned the Donbas, but half the Donbas. There was militarily nothing to stop us in 2014 taking much more, just as the Russians could have taken much more in Georgia in 2008 if they'd wanted to. I know some Russian politicians and figures who, if they saw themselves as being attacked by Ukraine in the Donbas, and there was a full-scale war which Ukraine lost, I don't think we can guarantee that Russia would stop at the Donbas this time round. It might lose its temper. By the way, let's for God's sake be clear-eyed about Navalny. This is a very brave man. It's a principled man. He's turned out, he's both resisted tremendous physical pressure, threats, and resisted, obviously, I imagine, tremendous offered bribes from the Putin administration. But this man is a Russian nationalist. He's not going to surrender.
Nicolai,
even if he comes to power, which, by the way, he won't.
Yeah. Nicolai, did you want to weigh in? I saw you kind of looking like you might want to.
I had a question about the level of engagement that doesn't really fit into what we're talking about, but might lead to a broader discussion. It seems to me there's two fundamental ways to approach international crisis. One is to take it and chop it down into smaller pieces and then say, let's deal with this. And if that works, then let's deal with the next little bit. Then let's work the next little bit, and we'll create an environment supportive of agreement slowly. We build trust slowly that way. The impediment to the success of that approach is if even one of the parties doesn't want to agree. It just doesn't see the benefit of having good relations. They see rather the benefit of having a permanent enemy, a perpetual enemy that will allow for us to be more united. So I think that's not to be underestimated. In that context, then I wonder if it's not better to approach this from a totally different perspective, which is to say, throw everything into the pot and let's have a grand new Westphalian agreement, okay? Which will involve having Russia and Ukraine together in Europe in some sort of mutually established, beneficial, written peace treaty that settles a whole bunch of issues at the same time, because there's so many different issues that we have to talk about. And since they're all interconnected, and I see this going on for a long time, obviously, just the negotiating process itself. But it seemed, I wonder whether, I have an inkling that given how stymied we've become with the piecemeal approach and all the different manifestations of the Minsk Accords, which have basically tried to drill down to something specific and come up with nothing, isn't it worth considering the big project and laying it out there? I know Medvedev did in his speech at Evian, and it got nowhere. But maybe that would ultimately prove more fruitful. I'm just wondering about that and what people thought about that.
Emma, what do you think about that more comprehensive approach?
I wish I had your ambition, Nicolai. I really do. I can see why this is tempting. It's the notion that if we could just find the underlying problems of all of our problematic relations with Russia, then we could have a concerted, overarching solution. The problem is I don't particularly see our approach over the last, maybe over the last few years as piecemeal, but prior to that, I actually think the US approach towards Russia was pretty consistent and overarching. And I think one of the key problems with the Ukraine situation is that we do keep trying to create issue linkage with other problems. So remember all the conversation in the late Obama era about, can we link what Russia's doing in Syria, and we'll make some concessions there, and maybe they'll give us some concessions at Minsk. And, so I think there has been an attempt to link some of these issues. And so even putting aside all of the political issues that a grand bargain with Russia would raise, and I think those are pretty significant even just here in the US, I am I just question whether we could even find an agreement or an accommodation that would actually work for both sides on that front. My inclination, I said it in my initial comments, but even after reading this paper, my inclination is almost to slice it up into even smaller chunks, right? So not to link discussions on Minsk and Ukraine and the Donbas, not to link that to the broader question of Ukrainian neutrality, and certainly not to link it out to arms control or pandemic preparedness or China or any of these issues, because I feel like maybe just focusing down in the concrete level is where we might be able to make some small progress. So I guess I would take sort of the exact opposite approach to Nicolai.
So where do you land, Anatol?
I mean, on that, I at least partly entirely agree. I do not think that there's any point in linking, say, Afghanistan, terrorism, cyberspace, you know, all these other issues, nuclear arms reductions, to Ukraine. And I think that there's a very good reason for that in realist thinking, if you like, which is that for Russia, Ukraine is a vital interest, a vital state interest. The others are secondary. Now, what that means is that you can offer Russia many concessions on secondary issues. Russia still will not surrender on Ukraine because it's a vital issue for them. And it would work exactly the same way, you know, for the United States in something that the US regarded as a vital issue. But the accompanying point is that for the United States, whatever the discourse in Washington may suggest, Ukraine is not a vital interest. And there's a very good definition of that. A vital interest is an interest for which you'll go to war. Russia will go to war in Ukraine. America will not.
Can I ask a more specific question?
Sure.
Anatol, you made the suggestion of a possible linkage in quid pro quo of Crimea for Kosovo. I think that's basically not likely because it's water under the bridge, and I don't think Kosovo is that important to Russia. But there is a quid pro quo which has been the subject of great discussion here in Ukraine and fear in Ukraine, because it's a plausible one, and it is Crimea for Donbas. You recognize Crimea, Ukraine recognizes Crimea, and we give up, Russia gives up on Donbas. And maybe throw in something about Nord Stream 2 and some money and put that into the equation so it sweetens the pot, essentially. But there's a quid pro quo that I think makes sense to a lot of people in this region, either because they like it and they think it's an attractive idea, or because it dashes all their hopes, whatever, you know, either one way or another, for confrontation or reconciliation. I wonder why you didn't see that as a more logical quid pro quo.
Well, but in a way, that's precisely what I've done. But the point is, yes, I mean, Ukraine gets the Donbas back, gets sovereignty over the Donbas as part of an agreement, you know, which also, with, you know, a new referendum and so forth, acknowledges Russian sovereignty over Crimea, but Ukraine only gets the Donbas back with a guarantee of autonomy, because without that, I don't think that there is the incentive for Russia to surrender. After all, Russia has the eastern Donbas and it has Crimea, and it can't be ejected from either of those places without a war, which either is unthinkable or which Russia would win. So the point is, yes, a deal, a quid pro quo, but autonomy for the Donbass still has to be there. Anything else would, I think, also represent a political humiliation for Russia and for Putin, which I think he would be very unwilling to undergo, or any Russian government would be unwilling to undergo.
Emma, real quick, what do you think about the Donbas Crimea exchange?
I mean, I think implicitly that is what Anatol is suggesting in the paper. And I think it really highlights the difference between the two situations, right? Crimea has particularly strategic significance to Russia, to the extent that long before this conflict actually happened, back when I was in grad school in the 2000s, we would talk about, why Sevastopol was so important to Russia, even though it was in Ukraine. And so Crimea is a very different kettle of fish than the Eastern Donbas. Russia has admitted its actions in Crimea, hasn't really in the Donbas. And so, the two are just very different. And I think that the main problem is it's not clear to me that a quid pro quo of one for the other versus packaging it as a broader deal that implicitly includes both those things. It's not clear to me that making an explicit quid pro quo would be acceptable to Ukrainian government. They obviously have to contend with popular opinion. They have to contend with various constituencies. If it appears as if they're effectively ceding a large chunk of their country in exchange for the Donbas becoming mostly autonomous, which also seems like they're ceding a large chunk of Ukraine, even if that is what the eventual political settlement has to be, it's going to be, framing it that way is going to be just really politically problematic. So for that reason alone, I would argue against just framing it as a quid pro quo, because it's going to be very unpopular.
Can I ask a very quick question?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Anatol and Emma, is there any way to have a settlement, a negotiated settlement, in which someone is not humiliated?
Anatol, why don't you take that one first?
Well, Nicolai, you know the internal situation in Ukraine, as well as anybody in the world, I imagine, as an observer. And surely the point is that for Ukrainian nationalists who both want to reincorporate these territories, Crimea and Donbas, and want to pursue a unitary policy of cultural and linguistic Ukrainianization, of course it's a humiliation, no question at all. Just as, independence for Kosovo was a humiliation for the Serbs, and one could produce endless, other examples around the world. But I think the point is twofold. One is that, in other circumstances, the international community, to give it that name, has been prepared to be tough in support of a solution which is in the wider international interest. But the second thing is, as you know better than anybody, this Ukrainian nationalist position does not represent the will of all Ukrainians. It may not even be a majority of Ukrainians. It's certainly not, if it is a majority, it's not a large majority of Ukrainians. It is, in fact, one section of the Ukrainian population which has sort of seized, if you will, the hegemony, but which continues to be opposed by many others. When I talk to the Russians, I have said again and again, you're crazy. And actually, they're not anymore. You said yourself, it's not really important. But any Russian who thinks that Russia should sacrifice itself for the sake of a Serbian Kosovo, or even opposing the legitimacy of Kosovo independence, is being foolish. He or she is deferring to absurd Serbian positions. That would be, in a way, my same advice to the United States and the West about Ukraine.
Yeah, if I could just add very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. One of the things that I really like that Anatol does in this paper is he puts the solution that he is suggesting for Ukraine in the context of previous political settlements of very difficult issues. What happened over Kashmir that India never recognized? What happened in Northern Ireland, right? Somebody who grew up in the west of Scotland, I am particularly, this is one that comes to my mind, but many people forget that, just 3 decades ago, there was effectively a war war on British territory. And so all of those settlements, as Anatol points out, have these things in common, right? They involve concessions from both sides. They involve framing those concessions in ways that make them politically palatable at home. And they involve some involvement from the international community in seeing that the conditions are carried out. And so while I do think, we need some more attention here to what those incentives for the parties and things have to be, I really like that what Anatol is doing is basically laying out a framework for this has worked before in other places. We can probably make it work in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We've run out of time. This is an amazing discussion, and I'm so sorry to our listeners that we didn't get to the vast majority of questions that came over. There was about 40 in the queue, and I'm very sorry about that. It's obviously a very stimulating discussion and lots to say about it. I just wanted to give everyone a heads up about another Russia-related panel that we have coming up on Thursday, the Biden-Putin Summit, Outcomes and Implications, on Thursday at 1 p.m. It's another Zoom webinar. Our panelists include Governor Jerry Brown, Katrina vanden Heuvel, Joseph Cirincione, and Anatol will be moderating that event. And so that will incorporate a lot of the news that will come out of tomorrow's summit. And then on the 23rd, we have another event entitled, Will Biden Deliver on His Promise to End U.S. Complicity in Yemen's War? That's going to take place on June 23rd at 11 a.m. The panelists include Bruce Rydell from Brookings, Radia Al-Mutawakkil. She is from the Yemeni Human Rights Group, Matwana. We have Anel Shalin, our Quincy Middle East Fellow, and Trita Parsi from Quincy will be moderating that event. So thank you all for being with us today and engaging in this conversation, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.